November 13th, 1943. Guadalcanal, Solomon Islands. Technical Sergeant Robert McManaman adjusted the frequency dial on his unit's radio receiver as dusk settled over Henderson Field. Through the static and atmospheric interference, a familiar voice emerged with crystalline clarity. "Greetings, everybody. This is your little playmate. I mean your bitter enemy, Anne, with a program of dangerous and wicked propaganda for my victims in Australia and the South Pacific." The voice was unmistakably American, speaking with the cadence and inflection that reminded every listening serviceman of home. What McManaman and thousands of other U.S. pilots didn't realize was that they were listening to the carefully orchestrated psychological warfare campaign designed to make them hear the voices of their mothers, girlfriends, and sisters calling them home from war. What the Japanese had created was far more sophisticated than simple propaganda broadcasts. The zero-hour program represented a revolutionary approach to psychological warfare that exploited the deepest emotional vulnerabilities of American servicemen fighting thousands of miles from home. By using native English speakers, particularly women whose voices carried maternal and romantic associations, the Japanese military had discovered how to weaponize homesickness and turn it into a tool of war. The voice that American troops dubbed Tokyo Rose was actually multiple women, but their collective impact was profound. They made lonely soldiers hear the voices of everyone they had left behind. The story of how U.S. pilots started hearing their mothers' voices over Tokyo doesn't begin with propaganda or psychological warfare. It begins with accident, desperation, and a Japanese military intelligence operation that stumbled upon one of the most effective forms of psychological manipulation in modern warfare. To understand why American servicemen became emotionally attached to enemy propaganda broadcasts, you must first understand the isolation and homesickness that defined military service in the Pacific Theater, and how the Japanese exploited these vulnerabilities with unprecedented sophistication. When the Pacific War began in December 1941, American military commanders had little understanding of psychological warfare beyond basic morale-building techniques. The Japanese, however, had studied American culture extensively and recognized that emotional bonds to home and family represented potential weaknesses that could be exploited through radio propaganda. The concept was simple but revolutionary. Use familiar voices speaking comfortable English to create emotional connections that would gradually undermine fighting spirit. The mastermind behind this psychological warfare campaign was Major Shigetsugu Tsuneishi, an officer in the Japanese Imperial Army's 8th Section G2 Psychological Warfare Unit. Tsuneishi had studied American media and understood that radio represented the most powerful communication medium for reaching dispersed military forces. His insight was that effective propaganda needed to sound like entertainment rather than political messaging. American soldiers would listen willingly to programs that provided music and companionship, even if those programs contained subtle demoralizing content. Tsuneishi's opportunity came with the capture of Major Charles Cousins, an Australian Army officer who had been a successful radio announcer before the war. Captured at Singapore in February 1942, Cousins possessed exactly the broadcasting expertise Tsuneishi needed to create convincing English-language programs. During an interrogation at Japanese General Staff Headquarters on August 1, 1942, Tsuneishi made his demands clear. Cousins would broadcast for the Japanese or face execution. What followed was a complex psychological chess match between captor and prisoner. Cousins agreed to produce radio programs but secretly planned to sabotage their propaganda value. He was joined by Captain Wallace Ince of the U.S. Army and Lieutenant Normando Reyes of the Philippine Army, both captured at Corregidor. Together, these three Allied prisoners of war began developing the zero-hour program that would become the most sophisticated psychological warfare operation of the Pacific War. The prisoners faced an impossible situation. Refusal to cooperate meant death, but cooperation meant betraying their countries and fellow servicemen. Cousins developed an ingenious solution. create programming that appeared to serve Japanese propaganda objectives while actually providing comfort and entertainment to Allied forces. The key was using double meanings, subtle jokes, and encouraging messages that Japanese censors wouldn't recognize, but Allied listeners would understand. The search for female broadcasters proved critical to the program's psychological impact. Tsuneshi understood that feminine voices would have greater emotional resonance with homesick servicemen than male announcers. The challenge was finding women who could speak natural, unaccented English and deliver scripts convincingly. Japanese women lacked the linguistic skills, while Nisei Japanese Americans were too few and often suspected of divided loyalties. The solution appeared in the person of Iva Toguri, a 27-year-old American citizen who had been stranded in Japan when the war began. Born in Los Angeles on July 4, 1916, Toguri had traveled to Japan in July 1941 to care for a sick aunt. When Pearl Harbor was attacked on December 7th, she found herself trapped in enemy territory, unable to return home and increasingly desperate for survival. Toguri's journey to Radio Tokyo began with economic necessity rather than political conviction. Unable to receive money from her family, who had been interned in American camps, she struggled to find employment in wartime Japan. Her American citizenship made her suspect to Japanese authorities, while her Japanese ancestry provided no protection against anti-foreign sentiment. By August 1943, she had found work as a typist at Radio Tokyo, preparing English-language scripts for overseas broadcasts. Major Kusens recognized Toguri's potential immediately. Her voice was naturally husky and masculine, the opposite of the sultry, seductive tones typically associated with propaganda broadcasts. More importantly, she was overtly pro-American and had already been helping Allied prisoners by smuggling food and medicine. Kusens believed he could trust her to participate in his sabotage efforts while providing the Japanese with the female announcer they demanded. The recruitment process revealed the sophisticated psychology behind the zero-hour program. Kusens explained to Toguri that her role would be to make the propaganda as harmless and entertaining as possible. She would call herself Orphan Anne, addressing her audience as fellow orphans of the Pacific, acknowledging the shared isolation of servicemen separated from their families. The scripts would be carefully crafted to sound like propaganda, while actually providing comfort and encouragement. Toguri's first broadcast on November 13, 1943, established the format that would make the zero-hour psychologically effective. She introduced herself with obvious sarcasm. "This is your little playmate, I mean your bitter enemy, Anne." The humor was intentional, designed to signal Allied listeners that the apparent propaganda was actually friendly communication. Japanese censors, lacking cultural context for American irony, missed the subversive messages entirely. The program's structure was carefully designed to maximize emotional impact on American listeners. It opened with "Strike Up the Band" by Arthur Fiedler and the Boston Pops, immediately establishing a connection to home through familiar music. Major Kusens then read 5 to 10 minutes of 25-word messages from prisoners of war to their families, providing genuine communication that demonstrated Allied prisoners were alive and thinking of home. Toguri's segment followed with 15 to 20 minutes of jazz and classical music, introduced with comments scripted by Kusens. Her voice was on the air for only 2 to 3 minutes per program, but those brief moments created powerful emotional connections. She played recordings by Duke Ellington, Benny Goodman, and other popular American artists while delivering encouraging messages disguised as propaganda threats. The psychological sophistication of the zero-hour program became apparent through its careful attention to the emotional needs of its audience. American servicemen in the Pacific faced unprecedented isolation from home and family. Traditional mail delivery took weeks or months when it arrived at all. Radio represented their primary connection to American culture and English-language entertainment. The Zero Hour filled this void with professional quality programming that reminded listeners of home while providing actual news and music. The targeting of aviators proved particularly effective due to the unique psychological stresses of aerial combat. Fighter pilots and bomber crews faced death on a daily basis while operating sophisticated machinery that required intense concentration and split-second decision-making. The mental strain of combat flying was compounded by the isolation of Pacific Island bases, where entertainment options were virtually non-existent and contact with home was sporadic at best. For pilots stationed at remote airfields like Henderson Field on Guadalcanal, Munda Point on New Georgia, or the primitive strips carved from coral atolls throughout the Central Pacific, the 0 hour became the highlight of each day. Flight operations typically ended by late afternoon, leaving long evening hours with little to occupy the mind except worry about the next day's missions and memories of home. The familiar voices emerging from shortwave receivers provided companionship that transcended the propaganda context. The psychological impact was intensified by the program's timing. Broadcasting from 6 to 7:15 p.m. Tokyo time placed the 0 hour during evening hours throughout the Pacific Theater, when homesickness typically peaked among isolated servicemen. The failing light and approaching darkness naturally triggered thoughts of home and family, making listeners particularly susceptible to emotional manipulation through familiar voices and nostalgic music. Captain Ince's American Homefront News segment exploited this emotional vulnerability with particular effectiveness. He read carefully selected reports of domestic disasters, accidents, and social problems gathered from monitoring American radio broadcasts. The content was factually accurate, but chosen to emphasize negative aspects of life in America. However, Ince's delivery was deliberately rushed and perfunctory, minimizing the psychological impact while satisfying Japanese requirements for demoralizing content. Lieutenant Reyes contributed a 15 to 20-minute segment of popular music with commentary designed to make servicemen homesick. His selection included romantic ballads and dance music associated with civilian life and relationships. The intended effect was to make listeners pine for girlfriends and wives left behind. However, Reyes worked with Cousins to choose songs that actually boosted morale through their associations with happy memories, rather than creating despair. The program's effectiveness stemmed from its psychological realism rather than obvious propaganda techniques. Unlike other Axis broadcasts that featured exaggerated claims and obvious lies, the 0 hour provided genuine entertainment and accurate information. American listeners trusted the program precisely because it didn't sound like propaganda. The familiar voices, quality music, and honest news created an emotional environment where servicemen felt connected to home and fellow Americans. Military intelligence reports documented the program's unexpected effects on Allied morale. Rather than demoralizing American forces, the 0 hour actually improved psychological well-being among troops who listened regularly. Servicemen gathered around radios each evening to hear the latest broadcast, treating it as entertainment rather than enemy propaganda. The shared experience of listening created social bonds within military units while providing regular contact with American culture. The voices that emerged from Tokyo radios carried powerful psychological associations for American listeners. Toguri's Orphan Anne persona reminded servicemen of sisters, girlfriends, and female friends from home. Her casual, friendly delivery style created intimacy that transcended the propaganda context. Many listeners developed genuine affection for the voice they knew as Tokyo Rose, imagining her as a sympathetic figure rather than an enemy agent. The phenomenon was particularly pronounced among fighter pilots who flew single-seat aircraft on long-range missions. Alone in their cockpits for hours at a time, these aviators developed intense parasocial relationships with the Tokyo Rose voices. During extended flights over the vast Pacific, pilots would mentally replay previous evening's broadcasts, using Anne's encouraging words and familiar music as psychological comfort during dangerous missions over enemy territory. Bomber crews reported similar experiences during lengthy flights to targets in the Central Pacific or Japanese home islands. The shared experience of listening to the 0 hour created common reference points that strengthened crew cohesion. Pilots, navigators, bombardiers, and gunners would discuss the previous evening's program during pre-flight briefings, using Tokyo Rose's commentary as a form of psychological preparation for combat missions. The psychological conditioning was subtle, but profound. Air crews began associating the 0 hour with safety, relaxation, and connection to home. These positive associations created powerful emotional anchors that provided psychological stability during the extreme stress of aerial combat. The familiar voices and music became mental talismans that helped maintain sanity and morale during extended periods of combat operations. The prisoner of war messages read by Major Cousins had particularly profound emotional impact. These brief communications represented the only contact many families had with captured servicemen. Parents, wives, and children throughout America listened desperately for mentions of their loved ones. When messages appeared, they were treasured as proof of survival and hope for eventual reunion. The Japanese intended these messages to emphasize Allied losses, but they actually provided comfort and maintained family connections. The music programming created its own form of psychological connection. Hearing familiar songs performed by popular American artists transported listeners emotionally back to civilian life. Dance numbers reminded servicemen of social events and romantic relationships. Classical selections provided intellectual stimulation and cultural continuity. Jazz and swing music connected listeners to the vibrant American musical culture they were fighting to preserve. By mid-1944, the 0 hour had become institutionalized as evening entertainment throughout the Pacific Theater. American commanders recognized that the program boosted rather than damaged morale, and made no effort to prohibit listening. Some units scheduled activities around broadcast times to ensure maximum participation. The shared experience of listening to Tokyo Rose became a unifying ritual that strengthened unit cohesion. The program's psychological sophistication extended to its treatment of war news and military information. Rather than making obviously false claims about Allied defeats, the 0 hour reported accurate information gathered from monitoring American broadcasts. This credibility enhanced trust in other program content while avoiding the skepticism that greeted obviously exaggerated propaganda. Listeners believed Tokyo Rose because she told them the truth about everything they could verify independently. The emotional bonds between American servicemen and the Tokyo Rose voices reflected deeper psychological needs created by the Pacific War's unique characteristics. Unlike European theater operations, Pacific combat involved long periods of isolation on remote islands with minimal contact with home. The vast distances meant that mail delivery was unreliable and leave opportunities virtually non-existent. Radio broadcasts became lifelines to emotional survival for men separated from everything familiar. The Japanese psychological warfare campaign succeeded in ways its designers never intended. Instead of demoralizing Allied forces, the 0 hour created powerful emotional connections that actually strengthened resolve to win the war and return home. The voices that servicemen heard reminded them of what they were fighting for, rather than why they should surrender. The program's failure as propaganda reflected its success as entertainment and emotional support. Allied intelligence gradually recognized the sophisticated nature of the Japanese psychological warfare operation. By late 1944, American analysts understood that the 0 hour represented an advanced form of propaganda that relied on emotional manipulation rather than obvious persuasion. The program's effectiveness stemmed from its creator's deep understanding of American culture and psychology, rather than traditional military indoctrination techniques. Military psychiatrists began studying the psychological effects of the Tokyo Rose broadcasts on combat personnel. Their research revealed that the program created complex emotional responses that defied simple categorization as either beneficial or harmful to military effectiveness. While the broadcasts clearly boosted morale and provided emotional support, they also intensified homesickness and longing for civilian life that could potentially affect combat motivation. The analysis revealed sophisticated understanding of psychological warfare principles that surprised American intelligence professionals. The Japanese had successfully identified and exploited fundamental human needs for social connection, cultural continuity, and emotional support that transcended national loyalties. The Zero Hour demonstrated that effective propaganda could work by providing genuine benefits to the target audience rather than obvious manipulation. Counterintelligence efforts to neutralize the Tokyo Rose broadcasts proved ineffective because servicemen actively resisted attempts to limit their access to the program. Military commanders who tried to prohibit listening faced widespread resistance from troops who valued the broadcasts as essential morale support. The popularity of the program among American forces made it impossible to suppress without damaging military effectiveness. The end of the Zero Hour came abruptly with Japan's surrender in August 1945. The final broadcast aired on August 12, 3 days after the atomic bombing of Nagasaki, and 3 days before Emperor Hirohito's surrender announcement. Radio Tokyo ceased operations immediately following the emperor's speech, ending one of the most sophisticated psychological warfare campaigns in military history. The aftermath revealed the true complexity of the Zero-Hour operation. Investigation by Allied authorities determined that the prisoner-of-war operators had successfully sabotaged the program's propaganda objectives while creating genuinely entertaining broadcasts. Charges against Major Kusens and Captain Ince were dropped when evidence confirmed their efforts to undermine Japanese objectives. Lieutenant Reyes was similarly cleared of treason accusations. Eva Toguri faced a different fate. Post-war hysteria about wartime collaboration led to her arrest and trial for treason, despite clear evidence that she had worked to help Allied prisoners and minimize propaganda effectiveness. Her conviction in 1949 reflected political pressure rather than legal evidence. She served 6 years in prison before release and didn't receive a presidential pardon until 1977. The voices that American pilots heard over Tokyo represented something more complex than simple propaganda or entertainment. They embodied the psychological sophistication of modern warfare and the power of emotional manipulation in military conflict. The Japanese had discovered how to weaponize homesickness by creating artificial maternal and romantic connections through radio broadcasts. Their success lay not in converting American servicemen, but in understanding their emotional vulnerabilities. The Zero-Hour program established precedents for psychological warfare that influenced Cold War and contemporary military operations. The use of familiar voices to create emotional connections became standard practice for propaganda broadcasts. The integration of entertainment with subtle political messaging evolved into sophisticated influence operations. The recognition that cultural understanding could be more powerful than military force shaped modern approaches to information warfare. The lessons learned from analyzing the Tokyo Rose phenomenon influenced American psychological warfare operations during the Korean War and subsequent conflicts. Military planners recognized that effective propaganda required deep understanding of target culture and psychology, rather than simple ideological messaging. The Zero-Hour demonstrated that entertainment value and emotional appeal could be more persuasive than obvious political content. Modern psychological operations continue to employ techniques pioneered by the Japanese during World War II. Contemporary information warfare recognizes the power of parasocial relationships, emotional manipulation, and cultural exploitation in influencing target populations. The Tokyo Rose broadcasts provided a template for using familiar voices and cultural references to create artificial emotional connections that transcend political boundaries. The phenomenon of American servicemen developing emotional attachments to enemy broadcasters revealed fundamental aspects of human psychology that continue to influence modern media and propaganda. The need for social connection, cultural continuity, and emotional support proved more powerful than ideological conditioning or military discipline. These insights shaped understanding of how mass media could influence behavior through emotional rather than rational appeals. Modern analysis of the Tokyo Rose phenomenon reveals the enduring power of voice and personality in mass communication. The emotional bonds that American servicemen formed with enemy broadcasters demonstrated the human need for connection and familiarity during times of stress and isolation. These psychological insights continue influencing contemporary understanding of media influence and emotional manipulation in information warfare. The legacy of hearing mothers' voices over Tokyo extends beyond military history to broader questions about identity, loyalty, and emotional connection during wartime. American servicemen who listened to Tokyo Rose broadcasts experienced complex emotions that transcended simple categories of friend and enemy. They found comfort in voices that reminded them of home, while recognizing the propaganda context of those communications. The sophistication of the Japanese psychological warfare campaign reflected broader changes in 20th-century conflict. Modern warfare increasingly involved battles for hearts and minds, rather than simple military conquest. The Zero-Hour program demonstrated that emotional manipulation could be more effective than physical force in influencing enemy behavior. Understanding these dynamics became essential for military and political leaders in subsequent conflicts. For 3 years during World War II, American servicemen gathered around radios throughout the Pacific Theater to listen to voices that reminded them of everything they had left behind. The women they called Tokyo Rose created emotional connections that transcended national boundaries and military objectives. Through careful attention to psychological needs and cultural understanding, the Japanese had discovered how to make their enemies hear the voices of mothers, sisters, and sweethearts, calling them home from war. On November 13, 1943, at Radio Tokyo, Eva Toguri began broadcasting as Orphan Anne to her fellow orphans of the Pacific. Her voice and those of other women working for the Zero-Hour program would become the soundtrack of homesickness for a generation of American servicemen. The propaganda campaign that was supposed to demoralize Allied forces instead provided comfort and connection during the darkest periods of the Pacific War. That's how U.S. pilots started hearing their mothers' voices over Tokyo through psychological warfare that weaponized homesickness, created artificial emotional connections, and demonstrated the power of understanding cultural psychology in modern conflict. The voices that emerged from enemy broadcasts reminded American servicemen of everything they were fighting to preserve and everyone they hoped to see again when the war finally ended.